this shading rendering part. So for now, I am hiding the strands to focus a little bit more on the cylinder. I am bringing a texture coordinate input. We're going to look at what it gives us and the normals that we can get as well. I add separate XYZ because we're going to put a mapping system that's going to be only at the top and only on the sides. To create this metal, I'm going to take Z, I'm going to create a math node compare. So let's say anything different of 0 with a margin of 0.5, it results as white. That's going to be our mix. Then we add a vector math, and then we're going to multiply, and we're going to start directly creating a noise to see what we're doing. Mix, I'm switching it to vector. I connect it in the mix. The multiply goes in the first input. We'll see what happens. We connect it into B instead. Here, we compress the mapping coordinate. Then I'm going to create another coordinate system, add a gradient. Switch it to radial to see coordinates rotating, and also I'm going to put here distance coordinates from 0. Before that, we multiply the Z coordinates by 0. It gives us a gradient that goes from the center to the outside, and it gives us a radial. I need to combine X, Y, Z and connect both into X and Y. If I look at my noise, my goal is rotate and compress it here. I'll certainly be able to change that by putting a node math multiply here. And this is my brush metal texture. Increase the metallic parameter. Anisotropic almost to 1. Play a bit with the roughness parameter. Add a color ramp. Set it to be spline. No need to have a lot of white in it. I'm looking for a very metallic result. Then we can add a bump node. It will be more visible with our final lighting. Connect this into height and lower the strength. I add a light and I decrease its size. I add a second light, just to better see the brush metal and also to see the strands of the fabric better after I enable the strands. I add another shader to them. I'm going to give them the cotton shader. So I add a hair BSDF. And he actually already has translucence capabilities, so it's pretty handy. It already has everything it needs to conduct the light. So I set it completely white and I save just to be safe. There we had our collection available and we had left a white background in the world. And what I'm suggesting is that you just go and get an HDR. I got a Studio HDR from hdrihaven.com that I'll find in resources and which immediately gives me a little dimension to my scene. There, I'm adding an animation to my camera, and for that I create an empty object and it will act as my pivot point for my camera. I'm going to put a first key on it at 0 and I'm going to put a second key at the end. We take a little look at which direction we want to move. So what we see here, actually, it's really not a big deal at all. It's a little bit of artifacts of the way Blender drew the curves. If we wanted to be more precise here, we can add a subdivision, but quite honestly, for the viewport, since we have our wick generated, it's not really useful. If I look at the animation that we have as it is, we have our curve that's being built, we've got our camera that's tilting. I set our animation to linear. I take a look at how the lighting behaves. So here I see that in my light I'm going to see the rest of the HDR. It's not something I'm interested in. I think we're not going to use it at all. We're going to start by enabling depth of field to blur out anything that might happen in the background. To see the focus point, you have to enable show limits, and now I can move around. Put here very sharp. I reduce the f-stop so that it's very blurry behind, and I add separate x, y, z on coordinates of my window, and it's going to give me just a vertical gradient if I only render y. I add a math node, set it to multiply add, and that's going to give me this little gradient there. Let's try inverted so that the light is coming more from below. And I mix all of that with the existing HDR. Mix and look at the world. That way we always have a little bit of details in the background, but at the same time we have this ramp that's drawn from the window. So we add a mix shader. We have a world that is all black, and we really only have our lights that we have placed in the scene that have the ability to illuminate our object. And so, if I connect here, the is-camera ray condition, in fact I have my object which is lit by HDR, I want the opposite, so I'll reverse my inputs. We have an object that is lit only by my lights, but I still have my HDR in the background, which can give us a lot of light. And then I realized that it would be more convenient to have this much farther away softer area. I boost it a little bit, even if it's further away. And this one too, which is lit from below, and we're going to put it a little bit stronger and bigger. We're looking for a slightly more interesting angle, and we can also not hesitate to put a little bit of color in it, which can be quite nice. A slightly warmer shade in this light that illuminates from behind again. And that's it for this scene, and we're going to be able to attack the lighting of the other shots. So now that our lighting is done on this shot, I'm going to reproduce pretty much the same thing on the other shots, either by retrieving the same world that we built, or by making it unique and clicking on the little 2 here, which gives me the clue that the world is used on several shots, 2 in this case, and duplicate exactly as well my light system to have the same thing to do pretty much on all shots. What's going to be just as important in these different shots is actually going to be to set our rendering properties. So for that, I go to the render settings, of course, to render on the GPU, since there we use the RTX accelerations that are available with NVIDIA. I'm not necessarily going to need a big sample right now, since we're going to render our animated sequence for the first time as drafts. I leave light tree checked. I can also leave the little stopwatch next to the seed enabled. This will random the rendering seed each frame. Max bounce actually, right here. I've already done a little bit of my optimization work, which will be more than enough for most of my shots, and the use tiling can be unchecked given that we render with the GPU. In the output settings, I make sure to render in 1.5 times the resolution I want to render in the end. That's just giving me a little more flexibility, finesse also in the rendering. And above all, if there is ever a little too much noise in my rendering, rather than sending with a sample that is too high. In fact, I will just downscale my image and I will gain definition like that. I set the P30 render folder for this shot. And then I have to do the same thing for the P10 and P20. I'm enable file extension, and I'm making sure here to render in OpenEXR multilayer, since I'm going to render in encapsulated full float and DWA. It's a small compression that is not really visible to the naked eye. So in the render passes, I won't use much of them. I am keeping the combine pass, ZDepth, and we're good to send our render, either with Control F12 or by clicking render animation.